Thank you very much for having me. My colleague Elizabeth Economy spoke here maybe last year or the year before, and she came back and she said that this was the highlight of her trip. My responsibility over the last 3 years has been digital and cyberspace policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about cyber risks and cybersecurity in the United States right now. And I think that some of the choices that the United States has made or is putting off making are very similar kind of choices that India is making or is putting off making about security and privacy and other issues like that. Before I get into the meat of the matter, I like to ask people to kind of hold 3 big thoughts in their mind that are related to cybersecurity and cyberspace. The first one is that the problem is only going to get worse. Right? We are all generating more and more data every year, and much of that is unconscious. Right? When we carry our phones with us everywhere, we are producing data every minute that's being collected by someone, and it's interesting to someone else. Right? And the problem is only going to become worse as we develop what is called the Internet of Things. Right? More and more devices connected to the Internet through sensors and other types of devices. So the prediction is by 2020, 50 billion devices will be connected to the Internet, and those devices are going to be vulnerable to all types of attacks. Oven on before you get home, you can do it. They didn't know, right? They didn't know it was connected to the Internet, and they probably had no idea what the password was, and the password probably was password. And so they never changed it, and they never did anything. So those types of things are happening, and it's not just going to be ovens, it's going to be cars. Right? We're now moving to either self-driving cars or cars that speak to each other and say, you're too close, and those are all hackable. Right? When you go home tonight, you should go to Google and you should search for car hack. And in it will show 2 hackers turning off a car from 20 miles away as a reporter drives on the highway. So first they just play with him, with the windshield wipers going back and forth, and the radio going up and down, and the air conditioning going up and down, and then they turn the car off. And he has to pull it to the side. These were very, very special hackers. One of them used to work for the NSA. So this is not the kind of thing that's going to happen all the time, but we are moving towards greater and greater vulnerability. So that's the first big idea. The second one is that governments were late to this area, but they are rushing in very, very quickly now. Right? So when we used to think about cyberspace in the 80s or 90s, we used to think about it as a kind of utopia, right? Individuals would be able to exchange ideas free. We would empower individuals to fight against the state. Maybe there will be some very scary hackers who could do things. But now we realize that states are as interested in cyberspace as everyone else, and they are rushing in, and they are doing what states do. Try to control, use it to fight wars, use it to promote propaganda in interests and ideas. So states have rushed into an area where they weren't before, but it's still a very strange area, right? Because it's a completely man-made structure. Right? We're not making more air or more sea or more space, but we're always remaking cyberspace. Right? Google, Facebook, they didn't exist 15 years ago. We don't know what we're going to be doing 15 years from now. So, and all of that is driven by the private sector, or at least it is now. And we have private sector actors acting very much like states. I mean, Facebook, if it was a country, would be bigger than most countries. And we have, in many cases, cybersecurity companies acting like intelligence agencies. Right? So in many cases, when we reveal cyber espionage or cyber hacking from China, the people that talk about it publicly is not the U.S., but it's companies called CrowdStrike and Mandiant and FireEye. And they're releasing what used to be the sole purview of the Mossad or the NSA or RAW or other intelligence agencies. They're revealing data. So we have this weird kind of mix of where states are rushing in, but the private sector is still very dominant. The third big idea is one that it seems weird to be saying actually in India, but I always used to like to say it to remind American audiences, which is that the internet was an American invention, but the future of the internet is clearly not American. The future of the internet is in Asia, right, and in Africa. But we're still reaching that inflection point, right? Asia is number one on number of users, but still 6 in penetration, right? India, what, 350 million internet users. So that means what, another 800, 900 million to come. Same thing with China. 650 million internet users, another 600 to come. Right? So twice the population of the United States. And Chinese users, Indian users, Indonesian users are going to have different conceptions of privacy and security than the Americans who built it, right? Or the Americans, their companies that are building it. And they're all going to be younger than probably most of the people here. Right? They're going to be, the vast majority of users in Asia are under 30, not under 25 or 20. Right? So they're going to have a different conception of privacy and security. And so even if we manage to get our mind around the problem now, it's going to be changing in ways that we don't expect. So what do we mean by cyber attacks or cyber war? And here it's really, I think, very important to kind of do a typology, right? Because the press is always saying cyber war or cyber attack. But I'm going to try to use the terms more concisely, right? Because how you describe it means it's a different type of policy problem, right? If it's a cyber war, then I want the Defense Department and I want the Pentagon involved and the intelligence agencies involved. If it's espionage or crime, then I probably want the police involved. If it's just protecting myself, maybe I want the companies and myself involved, defending myself. So the biggest problem for all of us that affects us in our everyday lives is crime, right? Cyber crime. Somebody trying to get your bank account, your credit card. Those are the things that we're all most likely to encounter. I'm not going to speak about crime because I'm going to focus mainly on the international relations problem about it, although there are attempts on how we cooperate to fight crime that I'm happy to talk about in the question. That's the biggest problem that most of us could be affected. The second largest problem is espionage, cyber espionage. And here it's important, I think, to think of maybe 3 separate categories. The first category would be mass surveillance, right? Which has primarily been the United States and its allies, often known as the Five Eyes, right? The UK, New Zealand, Australia, and others who are collecting massive amounts of data to prevent terrorist attacks and other national security concerns. And that has involved both Americans' data and, as we like to say, non-Americans' data, foreigners' data. And that's been cool. The second category would be political military espionage. Okay? This is what states do all the time to each other. And they're constantly trying to hack into each other and steal information. So in the United States, every defense program has been hacked, probably by Chinese hackers, if not Russian hackers. So the F-22, the F-30, the new destroyer, missile defense, all of those, as far as we can tell, have been compromised one way or the other. In India, the Navy was compromised, was attacked, probably also by Chinese hackers. And I think DRDO was hacked, and probably many other organizations who don't publicly talk about it. And that is what we would call political military espionage, right? You want to know what your potential adversaries are doing. And the other category is collecting information about groups you don't like, groups that might talk about you, being aware for political secrets. So again, Tibetan activists have been hacked in India and in the United States. If I'm going to think who's going to be interested in Tibetan activists, it's probably going to be the Chinese. The New York Times and Bloomberg and Washington Post wrote articles exposing corruption of high-level Chinese government officials. They get hacked. I'm probably going to think it's going to be Chinese hackers. Someone steals 22 million records of U.S. federal employees and their fingerprints, as well as their health data, as well as the data that they which airline they travel on. That might be the Chinese, it might be the Russians. Right now we think it's the Chinese. So this kind of hacking happens all the time, and everyone does it. Either you do it yourself, or if you're a small country, you buy the capabilities. Right? So one of the things that came out of the Snowden revelations was that countries buy on the black market what are called 0 days. Right? 0 days means it's a vulnerability that no one's ever seen before, so you have 0 days to fix. Right? So a 0-day vulnerability is usually very expensive because it means the hacker can get in. So there's a black market for these, and there are companies in Europe that will develop them and sell them, and we've seen many, many governments buy them, either for domestic reasons or to attack their espionage is probably the next biggest category, and it's a hard one to control, right? States always are going to spy on each other. So it's very hard to figure out how we would control that. Although I'm going to return to that. The third category is more rare, but happens fairly frequently, which I would call political hacking or political disruption. And these are attacks that generally have a political goal and may do some damage to data or the website, right? Or may just be a general nuisance. So this happens often in India, right? Pakistani and Indian hackers. Something happens, I don't know, a cricket match is lost, or somebody insults somebody else, and there's a lot of website defacement. Right? You put a Pakistani flag on the website of the Prime Minister's office or something like that. Generally, it's embarrassing and a nuisance, but it's not really cyber war. Right? It's just kind of a disruption. When you start escalating, then it becomes slightly more difficult. What people call the first cyber war was an attack which we think came from Russia on Estonia in 2007. The Estonians had a large statue of a Russian soldier in their downtown. And once the Estonians were liberated from the Soviets, they didn't really want to have it there any longer. And they wanted to move it to a Russian cemetery, and the Russians didn't like that. And so there is also a large Russian population, minority population in Estonia. So there were protests and then massive, what are called distributed denial of service attacks. Right? Distributed denial of service attack, one way to think about it is like 8 fat people try to go through a door at once. Right? You can't get in, and so you block all the traffic. So that's what happens with a DDoS attack. You send as much data as possible to a website, and you knock it off. That's what happened to Estonia. Estonia, for about 2 weeks, had to close up, had to shut itself out from the rest of the world because there was so much traffic coming from Russia that it couldn't keep the websites up. It mattered a lot to Estonia. Estonia is only a country of 1.6 million people. About 600,000 of them live outside of Estonia. Estonia is very, very e-government and e-banking focused, so people were seriously disrupted. But again, it wasn't a war, right? Nobody died. There was no invasion. But the Russians were sending a political message, right? We don't like what you're doing, and we're going to try to coerce you through these distributed denial of service attacks. The most recent attack would be the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures. So you may remember in December of last year, hackers got into Sony because they were angry about a movie called The Interview. Right? In the movie, 2 idiots try to assassinate Kim Il, the North Korean leader. And of course, the North Koreans saw this as particularly offensive and said, do not release the movie. Sony ignored it, and a series of cyber attacks started on Sony, which consisted of 2 parts. The first part was they destroyed a lot of data. So Sony came to work. None of the computers were working. They literally had to start using clipboards and paper, calling each other, and they had to find old BlackBerries that somebody had stored in a storage place somewhere. They pulled those out so they could use those. So internal business services was completely embarrassed. They stole a number of films, right? So new films that hadn't been released, they stole them and they posted them on some websites. And they what's called doxing. Doxing is to take a document that's private and make it public. So most of those documents were internal emails that were very embarrassing. People making racist jokes about the president, people calling Angelina Jolie a diva and not a very skilled director, and several other things like that, that if you're a director or a producer of a movie, is pretty embarrassing. And in fact, the woman who ran Sony eventually lost her job. Again, not cyber war, but political, right? Something trying to force what can be released or what can't be released. So I would consider that political hacking. Finally, what I consider cyber war, right? Cyber war would be a cyber attack that causes physical destruction or death. Right? Physical destruction or death. And we only have one instance of that. Right? The one instance of that seems to be the alleged Israel-U.S. attack on the Iranian nuclear program at Natanz. Right? That attack destroyed maybe 1,000 centrifuges. Right? But it caused physical destruction. We had never seen that before. We'd seen it in controlled cases. We knew that theoretically it was possible. But this was the first time that states physically destroyed something else through a cyber attack. So this was a pretty big deal, right? When you think about it, if the U.S. had landed commandos and blown something up, it would have been considered a use of force or an armed attack, right? And Iran would have been justified under international law to the right of self-defense. They could have responded, right? They chose not to with the cyber attack, either because at the time they didn't know who it was from, or they chose it, they're the weaker power, they can't choose. But we're going to have to make those kind of decisions. What type of attacks do we respond to, and what types do we not respond to? So those are the kind of categories that we've been thinking about, and I think it's important to keep clear in our mind. What the U.S. has done, or how the U.S. has been thinking about it, and again, I think these categories apply kind of internationally. The first one is a kind of a set of military and diplomatic issues. And the military one, quite honestly, has dominated, right? There is no doubt that the United States has said that cybersecurity is a national threat. It used to be at the bottom of the national threats. In the most recent threat assessment from the U.S. intelligence community, it's now number one. Right? So it went from the bottom to the top of threats. We have decided it is a national security threat. And what we've done is we have said, all right, if it's a national security threat, how do we deal with them? Like we deal with all problems. We try to push them out. Right? You want to deal with the attack before it ever gets to you. Right? Which was the U.S. way of dealing with terrorism in some ways. You kill the terrorists in Afghanistan or other places before they get to the U.S. And so cyber, we've thought kind of the same way. And so in 2010, the United States created Cyber Command in the Pentagon. When you look at the U.S. Defense Department budget, everything is being cut except for three things. Those three things are Special Operation Forces, drones, and cyber. Those are the only parts of the U.S. budget that are not being cut. And Cyber Command went from about 995 people to more than 6,000. Right? So we are thinking about how do you use cyber as a military weapon. There has been very, very little transparency about what we think about it. Right? The United States has released two strategies, two Defense Department strategies. And the first one basically says, yes, cyber is a weapon. And the second one is slightly more transparent. The second one says, cyber is a weapon. If we're attacked, we can choose how we're going to respond. And we have three types of cyber troops. Two of them are involved in defense. One of them is involved in offense. But how we might use the weapons, or under what conditions, are still unknown, or not explored. All it says is the president can order a cyber attack, and he's the only person who can order a major cyber attack. And you can use it in support of, what is called combatant command. So you're fighting in Afghanistan. You think it would be useful to turn off the Taliban's cell phones. You can do an attack like that. But that's all that we know so far. So that has been kind of the big push on the defense side. And you can see lots of countries now talking about, should we have a cyber command? Right? India has talked about, should they have a cyber command? China officially doesn't have any cyber troops, so they haven't talked about it. But the Russians are going to set up a cyber command. Israel just set up a cyber command. So this is the type of thinking that is expanding again. And again, as I said, if you don't have the capabilities, you buy them. You buy them from somewhere else. So that's the kind of military push. The second area has been diplomatic, right? And that effort has really focused on how do we start to think about what the rules of the road are? What are the behaviors we want to encourage, and what are the ones we don't? And here the United States differs from the other big countries, in particular from China and Russia. China and Russia have traditionally said cyberspace is completely new. Right? We don't understand what's happening here. We need new treaties. Right? And in fact, we need to control cyber weapons like we controlled nuclear weapons. We need to have arms control. The United States has said, doesn't make any sense. You can never have an arms control treaty for cyber weapons. Right? I have a cyber weapon in my pocket. It's called my cell phone. Right? All of you have cyber weapons at home, in your laptops and in your pockets. You can't control math. Right? Anyone who can program can create a cyber weapon. So from the U.S. position, there's no way to create a kind of control regime like we did with nuclear weapons, right? You count them, you verify them, you say where you're going to store them. None of that is possible in cyber. So the U.S. has said, no, we need to have kind of soft rules or soft treaties, or what are called norms of behavior, the rules of the road. And we've said, well, basically, the law of armed conflict already applies, right? So we have some rules already for how we fight a regular war, a kinetic war, when we blow things up. And the United States has argued that those rules should apply in cyberspace. So the main three rules of the laws of armed conflict are neutrality, distinction, and proportionality, right? Neutrality means, you don't kill people that aren't involved in the combat. Proportionality means if, you blow up a ship, I can't bomb an entire city. And distinction means I'm only trying to strike military targets, right, not civilian targets. So in the cyber world, all of these things will be complicated, right, more complicated than they are in the real world, right? Neutrality. Every single attack that happens always goes through another country's network, right? When the Chinese hacked the United States, or when Russia attacked Estonia for this cyber war, they all went through different networks. So neutrality is always violated. And if I want to stop the attack, am I going to take down a server in Germany or wherever else the traffic is coming through? So neutrality is a big problem. Distinction is a problem because all of our networks are intertwined. There are very, very few networks that are just military networks. Right? Maybe, for the United States, it's maybe 5, 10 that are just military. The U.S. Military, 90% relies on civilian networks. So if I'm going to try to take out some military target, very, very likely that I'm going to take out a civilian target. Right? And we saw that cyber weapons almost always have unintended effects. Right? One of the most infected countries for Stuxnet, right, was India. Stuxnet spread to India, Indonesia, and lots of other countries. Stuxnet was a very complicated weapon. It was only designed to work on specific systems. So it didn't do any damage when it spread to India or Indonesia or other places. But you still had to spend the money to get it off your system. Right? It was still a big nuisance. So cyber weapons are always going to have these unintended effects. So the United States has argued we need to have these discussions about what the rules of the road are. And we are at the very, very beginning stages of this. And we have just started. And it's happening very, very slowly, and not enough countries are participating. So we had a fairly big breakthrough this summer at the UN. So there's a group of government experts that represent 20 countries. And they said, okay, we think there are 4 norms that we can all agree on. And the 4 norms are, the first one is, during peacetime, you should not attack another country's critical infrastructure, right, with a cyber weapon. That's a pretty soft norm because you're not supposed to be attacking people in peacetime anyway. Right? So during peacetime, let's not cyber attack each other's critical infrastructure. The second norm was you should not attack another country's computer emergency response team, what's called a CERT. Right? So India has a CERT. It's a national level organization that if there's a major attack, they come and help. Right? So you shouldn't attack the people that are trying to help remit a large attack. The third norm was you have a responsibility for attacks that come from your territory. Right? So what Russia said during the attacks on Estonia, they said, we don't know anything about these attacks. Right? These are patriotic Russian citizens who are very, very upset about the statue. And if they want to express their patriotism by knocking off Estonian banks, what can we do about it? Right? These are patriotic hackers. This norm says no. If you have a responsibility, like you do in international law, for what is coming from your territory. You need to stop it. And the fourth norm is you need to help someone who's being attacked. Right? So if I am a country and I see all these attacks coming from your territory and I say, please, you must stop them, under this norm, you're supposed to say, okay, I'll see what I can do. But this is, again, very, very early stages. And this was a group of experts at the UN. This was not the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly. These are just recommendations. So all of these things have to begin to be discussed. And we just don't know yet, right? Some of the things are very clear. Right? If you kill someone, it would seem that fairly clear that that would be a use of armed force, or a use of an armed attack or use of force, right? And you could respond. But what happens if you launch an attack on the stock market? And if it goes down for 1 day, is that enough that you can then bomb something? Or does it have to be 3 days? Or what happens if you damage an entire country's health records? Would that be considered destructive enough? Right? So we don't have any agreed upon norms yet. The other problem is for the defender, it's very hard to tell why the attacker is in your system. Right? If I'm defending, let's say I work at the power grid, right? And I see a hacker is in my system. I don't know exactly if the hacker is there because they want to steal some information. You know, maybe I have some proprietary way of shifting load, you know, to make sure that I can do it more efficiently and I don't create blackouts and, you know, I can create more profit. Or is the hacker there to what's called mapping the battlefield, right? Seeing where their vulnerabilities are, trying to understand, well, if I make this node go out, I can create a cascading failure and all of Hyderabad goes into the darkness. From the defender's position, I don't know. I can't tell. And the difference between the two is probably 3 or 4 keystrokes. Right? So those kind of things, we probably want to start sending messages to each other. This is very bad. This maybe we can live with. Right? Because the one kind of common accepted wisdom in cyberspace is that the attacker always has the advantage. Right? The defender has to defend millions of lines of code, thousands of pieces of devices, many, many networks. They have to be right all the time. Right? The attacker only has to be right once. And they can keep trying over and over and over again. Right? And the sad fact is people are really dumb. Right? Most of the attacks happen not because of some very, very sophisticated attack, but because you click on something you're not supposed to click on. Right? One of the most damaging attacks that happened to the United States, we think happened from the Russians, seems to have happened because the Russians left thumb drives. You know, everyone's seen a thumb drive? They left them in the parking lot outside the Pentagon, or in the bathroom at military contractor conferences. You're a human being, you see a thumb drive, you pick it up, you're like, oh, a thumb drive. You go back to your office, you say, I wonder what's on it. You stick it in. That's what people do, right? That's what people do. So, unfortunately, no matter how high you get the defense, and so since I said people are dumb, I'll include myself in this one. We are constantly attacked, my organization, and so we have training. And the training is to help you identify what's called spear phishing emails, right? Spear phishing email looks like it comes from somebody that you know, and will have a PDF or a link to something that to click on. So we're trained not to do it. So I received one 2 days ago. It came, I don't know, it must have been about 7:45 Eastern time, so what, 9:30 here at night, so after a long day of me being around giving talks and being kind of tired. And the email said, Dear Dr. Segal, your blog has material on it that is owned by my client, intellectual property on it by my client, and if you don't take it down in 48 hours, we're going to sue you. Please click this link to see what the material is. So my first response is, oh my God, I'm going to get sued. And I click on the link, and thankfully it was a test. The big thing comes up on my screen that says, you should not have clicked this. You need to come to security training. And before this moment, I was the only person in my organization that was exempted from security training. But now I have to go. So my only point is that the defender is never going to keep the attacker out. What that means is that defense doesn't seem like it's going to work. And so the answer seems to be offense, right? And then once you have in what's called in the international relations field offense advantage, meaning that you want to move quickly as possible, right? You want to use your weapon quickly before the other side uses it because you want to get it off. Or the other side might patch, right? You may have been sitting on this 0-day that was so expensive and so valuable, and the next thing you know, Microsoft patches, and it's gone. Not useful anymore. So from a policy-making, foreign policy perspective, offense advantage is very destabilizing. Right? You want to have a system where everyone thinks we have time. Right? You don't want to have to escalate very quickly. So this is kind of the discussion in the policy, military, diplomacy area, and that's actually one where the United States has a great deal of confidence right now that India is going to be a very important partner. Right? So this year, the United States and India restarted its whole of government cyber discussion. And these kind of questions about thresholds, rules of behavior are ones that we would very much like to talk to India. The other norm that the United States has tried to promote, which it hasn't been very successful at, is that there's kind of good hacking and bad hacking. Right? The good hacking is kind of political military espionage, which is what every type of state is going to do. And the bad hacking is the theft of intellectual property to help companies. Right? So what we say the Chinese do. Right? Chinese hacker breaks into Apple, steals something, gives it to Xiaomi. Somebody breaks into Cisco, gives it to Huawei. Right? This is an argument the United States has made that we're all going to hack, but it should be good hacking, not bad hacking. This is not an argument that lots of people buy. Right? Other countries do commercial hacking, not just China. Israel, France, South Korea. If you come from a country with state-owned enterprises, there's no reason to make a distinction between private enterprise and public enterprise, right? And a lot of people don't really believe the United States, right? So one of the things that came out of the Snowden revelations was, well, yes, the United States was hacking EU trade negotiators, and the United States was hacking Petrobras, an energy company. And yes, the United States was hacking Huawei, the Chinese telecom company. And when that came out, the United States, the Director of National Intelligence said, maybe, but we hack those types of targets for national interest reasons, not to help specific companies. Right? We do it for our own economic good, but we don't turn around and give it to companies. That always struck me as a very fine distinction that if I were not American, would be very hard to buy. Right? It's not going to convince a lot of people about this norm. But that is the one thing that came out of one of the things, the surprising things that just came out of the meeting with President Xi and President Obama. Right? No, I, among many other analysts, thought there would be no progress with China on cyber. But what came out of the joint statement was China said no country should commit commercial cyber espionage. This is from a country that says they never did it in the first place. And, so you have to question about what they meant by it. And today in the Washington Post, there was a story from one of these companies that I mentioned earlier, CrowdStrike, that said, oh, by the way, we still see Chinese hacking. So we'll have to see about how the Chinese have accepted it. So those are the norms. Those are the rules of the behavior. The second major kind of issue that also, again, affects across the world, and particularly is a difficult one for democracies, is where does the government's responsibility begin or end, and where does the private sector's responsibility begin? Right? Because in the United States, we have a division of responsibility. The Defense Department, the Pentagon, is supposed to defend Defense Department networks with .mil. Right? The Department of Homeland Security is supposed to defend the State Department and other U.S. government agencies, so .gov, and some critical infrastructure. right? So power grids, petroleum, those kind of things. And then basically everybody else is on their own. Right? We have to defend ourselves. But lots of people say, well, yeah, I can defend myself against most criminals, but am I really supposed to keep the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, out as a company? How am I supposed to do that? So we have been constantly trying to figure out where do you divide the line, but also don't create incentives for the companies to underinvest, right, and not take care of their own security. So when Sony was hacked, right, the first thing that they said was, this is the most sophisticated attack we have ever seen. Right? This is what companies always say. So sophisticated. We cannot believe it. This was not a sophisticated attack, right? Sony had terrible, terrible security. Right? Sony had been attacked many, many times before. They had many enemies. Sony had many enemies, hacking groups who didn't like them because of their copyright rules, people who were pissed off about video games. They had many, many enemies, and they should have done much, much better on cybersecurity. It was so bad at Sony that they had a file storing all the passwords called passwords. Okay, so the question becomes, who's responsible for that? Right? Was that really the United States government's responsibility? And you could see the U.S. was really very flustered about, the U.S. government was flustered about how we should respond, and should it respond? So from the beginning, there was very little. The United States didn't say anything. Then somebody came out and said, well, it's North Korea. Well, then when they said it was North Korea, then some people said, well, what are we going to do? And people like Senator John McCain said, this is cyber war, right? Cyber war means we should attack North Korea. The president came out and said, no, 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 this is cyber vandalism. Right? A phrase that nobody had ever heard before. But vandalism means, well, you know, you deal like with a cop, or you kind of spray paint it over and you kind of move on your way. But the question is, where does that responsibility lie? And we are still having this debate for 20 years. Still, we've been having this debate. Part of the problem, of course, is that the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, nobody has any confidence in. I assume many of you have traveled to the United States and have been through TSA security at the airport, and you realize where that lack of confidence comes from, because they seem incompetent. And no one ever stays at DHS to do their job in cybersecurity, and all of the technical competence is in the National Security Agency, in the NSA. But we have a problem. The NSA is not allowed officially to operate in the United States. Right? It is only supposed to be doing foreign intelligence gathering. And you know, after the Snowden revelations, people don't really trust the NSA any longer. So the question is, how is the NSA going to step in and defend? So the answer so far has been information sharing. Right? We can't necessarily figure out where the line is, but one way we're going to do it is through information sharing, which means I've seen an attack, I have fought it, I see how the attackers work, and if I can share that information as quickly as possible, then the attacker can't go, you know, knocking on every door until he finds one that's open. And we now have several kind of organizations that are in place and executive orders that help share that information. Traditionally, the problem has been the government is happy to take lots of information, but not all that happy to share information, right? It comes from intelligence capabilities, it's classified, and so they haven't shared. They've done better, but it's still a problem. The other problem is liability law, right? So if I'm Facebook and I share attack information and it includes some private information in it, right now I'm not protected. A user could sue me for privacy violation or other liability violations. So we've been trying to pass these laws to try and do this, but it's been bogged down. Right now, the current bill has 22 amendments, which means it's never going to go anywhere. What this means is, in the interim, is that the companies do it themselves, and this is, you know, probably already happening in India, and is probably an area of cooperation for the United States and India. And the best area of cooperation where this works is in the financial sector in the United States. All of the banks already share the threat information. Right? They do it. It's, in many cases, it's based on trust. Right? People that have known each other for decades have fought these threats for decades, and so they manage to share the information. The problem is it doesn't scale. Right? You have to build trust takes time. Right? It takes face-to-face meetings, and so how do you do it? And threat information sharing is not going to solve every problem, right? Because as I mentioned, there are 0 days, attacks that no one's ever seen before. So you can't keep those out. So this is the kind of debate we've had over public and private, and where do you draw the line? The final area, which is probably unique to the United States, is what role should the government playing in regulation? And it being the United States, of course, the answer is none, or traditionally none. So there has been many people that have argued that, no, this is ridiculous, and that the especially critical infrastructure should be forced through legislation to meet minimum standards, right? What minimum standards of cybersecurity is. The problem is that nobody knows what those standards will look like, right? Because the attacks are constantly changing. And the companies, the technology companies, have been very successful in arguing that you don't want checklist security, right? You don't want the government saying, you need to have a firewall, you need to do this, you need to do that, because basically all that means is you have a security person and he checks those boxes. But the attacker knows what boxes are being checked, and they find a new vulnerability. So how do you manage to create the right incentives for companies to invest without, again, creating this disincentive to invest, without over-regulating and suppressing innovation? And the answer that we've come up with is voluntary standards. So the government, in cooperation with the private sector, has developed these standards, and then there will be some incentives, perhaps tax breaks. You'll be more eligible for government procurement, and how do you promote those kind of standards? So that's where we stand on the regulation side, but that may change, right? You can imagine if we had a destructive attack, then very quickly, like after 9/11, where we rushed through a huge amount of legislation, we would rush through a huge amount of legislation that dealt with cyber attacks. So I'm gonna close up. It's almost impossible to end on a positive note on a cybersecurity attack talk. I have often tried, but I almost never do. And so I will try. And so there are two positives that may be perhaps change the situation. The first one is quite honestly awareness, right? So, and not, it's great that all of you came, and this is the first cyber talk perhaps that you've had, but also clearly at the corporate level, right? People now, it used to be cybersecurity, it didn't matter that much. We got breached or we got hacked, we'll fix it, it just won't cost us that much. It's not worth to invest it. That is changing, right? More and more companies, more and more government officials all realize this is a real problem, and are committed to doing, hopefully the right thing, but doing something. So that's the one positive. The second positive is, as I said, is that nobody knows technologically where we're going to be, right? And the system that I've described now could change. So one of the things, as I said before, the kind of common wisdom is that the attacker always has the advantage, right? And the reason is what's called the attribution problem, right? I said you could route your attack through different networks, and it's very hard to see where it's coming from. That is becoming easier to do. Attribution is becoming easier. So the official U.S. government line now is a hacker should expect to be identified in the network and eventually identified for their identity. It may take us a while. The forensics may take weeks, but we are growing more confident that we can identify an attacker. The third part of it, who's responsible, is going to be much harder and probably out of reach, right? So even if I see that it's a Chinese hacker living in a dorm owned by the People's Liberation Army, I still am not going to with 100% be able to say who ordered the attack, but these days I can say it's this guy, right? He goes by the name Ugly Gorilla online, but his real name is Wang Ping. So attribution is getting better, and so that would change the balance. And then also you hear more technologically, as we move into more and more big data collection and machine-to-machine communication, right? So you take the human out of it, right? Because part of the problem with defense is a huge amount of false positives, right? Everything looks like it's an attack, and you start ignoring everything. So you start collecting more and more data about what is supposed to happen in your network, and you have machines communicating with each other. then you can start to really get a very good picture of the attack and perhaps eliminate it all. Of course, automation raises its own problems, right? Because then as you automate defense, you probably automate the attacks as well. And then the question becomes, what role do we play there? So those are my two slightly positive notes, and I'm happy to take questions.
Before you get on to questions.
Phishing, right? So again, an email or an attachment that you click on and you shouldn't, right? So my other joke, what I'd say was before I revealed that I actually am not that good at it, is that every week or every 2 weeks I get an email from my boss, and it says, you know, dear Adam, President is going to Asia next week. I thought you'd want to see his agenda. I delete everything from my boss now, right? Because if I look at the email address, instead of being, you know, President at CFR, it'll be haasrichard@yahoo.com, right? So I know that that's fake. So the vast majority of people are going to see spear phishing. Stuxnet, I will describe as much as I can, but there is a great book that describes what happened with Stuxnet called Zero Day, I think. Stuxnet was incredibly complicated, right? Because the challenge was for the most secure systems are the ones that are not connected to the internet, right? It's called an air gap, right? So we'll just say it's Israel and the United States. Let's say it was Israel and the United States. Israel and the United States had to figure out how to get the infection into the system that was not connected to the internet. And they also wanted to design an attack that wasn't immediately knowable, right? They wanted it to spread along for a long time so that they could basically string it out for as long as possible. So the Stuxnet included 5 0 days, right? So as I said before, most 0 days are pretty expensive. Most attacks include 1 0 day, maybe 2. So the fact that it had 5 meant that some very, very sophisticated attackers were there. They also had a way, Stuxnet would infect the machine. It would look around to see if the machine was connected to a specific configuration of centrifuges run by a Siemens system, a Siemens control system. It would look for that system. That was the only system that it wanted to infect. So that meant that's why when it spread to India and Indonesia and other places, it didn't do any damage. And because it spread back to the United States, too. So it looked for this very specific configuration. If it didn't see that, it would wait until somebody else would plug in something else, and it would hop to the thumb drive, and it would wait till it get plugged into the next computer. Then it would look again. Every once in a while, it would beacon home and get updated. And so something would get downloaded, and then it would start the process again. Finally, it found what it was looking for. We don't know exactly how. Either, again, an Iranian service person had a thumb drive. It's possible that the Siemens repair person came and that was infected that way. We're not exactly sure of how it got into the system. Once it was in the system, it did 2 things. Well, actually, it did 3 things. Some of the centrifuges, it span up and slowed down. Span up and slowed down, but it continued sending the message to the operators that everything's fine. Right? So all of you have probably seen movies where they rob the bank and they put the video that the bank looks fine. This is the exact same thing. They played, basically said, everything's fine, everything's fine. And they opened and closed valves and did the same thing, sent the message. And so we think that the Stuxnet destroyed about 1,000 things. And then eventually it escaped. We don't know how. The U.S. blamed Israel. Israel blamed the U.S. But it escaped. They got too aggressive, and it started spreading. And people didn't know what it was. And first it was a Bulgarian company, discovered it and said, oh, this is interesting. And then they sent it to a U.S. company, and they said, oh, this is really interesting. And then basically 3 companies, a German company, a U.S. company, and a Russian company, took it apart. And then they finally began to realize, oh, this is designed for a specific set of centrifuges. That's the most sophisticated attack we've seen. But again, that's why I'm not all that worried about cyber war, right? Because the resources that went into making that are probably limited to 5, maybe 7 countries. And I don't think countries are going to attack each other out of the blue. Right? If there's a military conflict, yes, they'll use these weapons, but it's not going to be, I don't know if Die Hard 4 ever became popular here, where things just start blowing up. That's not what's going to happen. The malware was known as Stuxnet, S-T-U-X-N-E-T. That was what the malware was called. The operation was called Olympic Games. The malware was called Stuxnet, I think because there's part of the code. So you can see often there's, like when you start taking the code apart, they try to figure out where it comes from. So what language is embedded in the code? What timestamps are there? So you can see, oh, this code was developed between 9 and 5 Moscow time. You can reset the timestamp, but it's a piece of clue. One of the early things that came out the Stuxnet when they started unraveling it was a date, and I can't remember the exact date, but when they pulled it apart, it was the date that 8 Jews had been hung in Iran, and they said, "Oh, look at this date; it matches with the date that these hangings happened in Iran." Then there was the word myrtus, M-Y-R-T-U-S, myrtus. They said, "Oh, what is myrtus?" Myrtus is a type of plant, and in Hebrew it's Hadassah, and Hadassah refers to Queen Esther, and in the story of Queen Esther, that happens in Persia. This was one of the more convoluted ones because myrtus could probably mean my RTU. RTU is a remote transport unit or remote transfer unit. So that was probably the more justified explanation. But once you start going down this road, then you can start pulling things up.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. All yours, R.K. Dhanwada.
Can you mention about Snowden and Julian Assange?
Yes.
I mean, what is your take? Because he won the world across the heart. The governments got embarrassed.
Yes.
So what is your take?
So I don't have much to say about Assange, quite honestly. The WikiLeaks, I think, was embarrassing to the United States, but not that embarrassing, to be quite honest. I think we overreacted. I don't think there was any reason to go around and say we need to knock WikiLeaks out. When you read the cables from around the world, the United States actually acts mostly like it says. There are embarrassing things where we say bad things about some of the people we deal with, but WikiLeaks I really don't think was that big an impact. Snowden, my answer is I like to think of it in 3 parts. Right? So Snowden took 3 types of information, or the information falls into 3 different categories. The first is the collection of metadata, right? So metadata is the information about when you made a call, who you made it to, and how long the call lasted for, but not the content, right? That information was collected on Americans, even though the U.S. government said it wasn't, and then Snowden revealed that, right? So in my perspective, that was Snowden acting like a whistleblower, right? The courts have ruled that the NSA overstepped their authority and interpreted the law in a way that they shouldn't have had. So to that extent, Snowden's actions were whistleblowing-like actions. The problem for me is that the other 2 types of information that Snowden released is not whistleblowing, in my view. The second is spying on our friends, right? Spying on our friends is unpleasant and may be improper, but everyone does it. Right? The French got very upset. The Germans got very upset. I'm sure there were revelations about Delhi that everyone's upset. But the fact is that friends spy on friends. Right? The United States should have asked itself at some point, is it worth it? Just because we can do it, should we do it? And I think there is a great example with Merkel, right? Angela Merkel. The United States government has known Angela Merkel for 20 years. It's very unlikely that we learned a lot from her phone calls that we couldn't have just asked her. So, and you look at the fallout now from Snowden, in particular in Germany, and the collapse of the Safe Harbor Agreement, which Safe Harbor Agreement is an agreement that allows U.S. companies to bring data from Europe to the United States because European privacy requirements are much higher. That agreement has collapsed in the wake of Snowden. And so the economic damage to the United States must be many, many fold worse than whatever it is we learned from tapping Angela Merkel's phone. So second category, I don't see him as being a whistleblower. I see it as damaging U.S. interests. It was self-inflicted U.S. interest damage, but still damaging U.S. interests. And the third, quite honestly, is espionage against our enemies or potential enemies. So releasing espionage against Russia and China and North Korea and Al-Qaeda and others. What public interest is served to be quite honest, for Russia to know what the United States can or cannot do in that sense. So from my perspective, he should have been more careful with what he took. I don't know if we're at the end, quite honestly, right? Because the NSA, or at least they've stopped saying publicly. At one point, it was 1.45 million. Some of the releases have been very ably timed to do damage to certain relationships, bilateral relationships. I don't know what else is coming. I mean, they've already done a lot of damage. But again, I think a lot of it was self-inflicted, right? It's clearly in the United States' interest for people around the world to trust U.S. companies, right? That was one of America's greatest sources of strength and influence. After Snowden, that is a very hard issue, right? And the companies clearly are very angry.
Hi there. Thanks for an interesting talk. My question is, not too long ago, I'm sure you've heard that former Congressman Tom Perriello set out to do the QDDR, the Quadrennial Data Diplomacy Review, on behalf of Senator Kerry. Has such a data-oriented program that's been carried out in conflict-ridden areas like Africa, has that made the government a little more vulnerable to cybercrime? And are there any safeguards against that?
You mean attacks coming from developing countries?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of the data-oriented nature of the program.
Yeah, so there is a big push now in what's called capability building or capacity building. It's one of the big push of Britain. Actually, Britain now has a center at Oxford that's totally focused on cyber capacity building. The Dutch are very interested in capacity building. The U.S. Has been interested. There's been several engagements with Kenya and other countries that are coming online, and to make sure that they just don't become criminal havens like Nigeria. It's interesting because development and security work have always been separate, and development workers generally don't like to be associated with the government or security work, and so it'll be interesting to see in this realm if they manage to kind of solve that issue. The other problem is it is becoming slightly kind of a great powers kind of competition, right? So part of the motivation for the United States to be involved in these markets is to make sure that it's not Huawei, right, the Chinese telecom, because if you install Huawei equipment, not only did the U.S. company lose the contract, but the worry is that the country will start thinking about the internet like China thinks the internet, right? So a more closed internet, a more controlled internet, a more repressed internet, and internet governance views that the United States doesn't support.
We know that Stuxnet is very complex, and we can see people taking it apart in some blogs and YouTube. How much is it really possible to reprogram it to a different source for an attack? Yeah, so you can download Stuxnet off the web, and then, as this gentleman said, you can try to take it apart. You can try to reprogram it. As far as I've seen so far, no one has been very successful in reprogramming it for a destructive attack. Right? So it turns out so far destructive attacks are still very hard, right? Because again, not only do you have to have this very complicated delivery system, but you also have to understand the system that you're trying to destroy. And so the knowledge of nuclear centrifuges control systems is pretty narrow. And most industrial control systems are legacy systems, right? So they may come from the 70s or 80s, so they use programming languages that are not widely adopted. So it's much more common in crime and espionage than it is for industrial control systems, but that's going to change, right? What we're seeing is that individuals' capabilities are increasing and countries' capabilities are increasing. And last week there was a report that ISIS had been trying to hack into the U.S. power grid. Fortunately, they're very bad at it, but that will change. That will change over time.
I was about to ask, cyber war can change the balance of power worldwide. It need not be based on the capability of having nuclear arms and military capability.
Yeah.
A small country in a small island can actually start ruling the world if it acquires the capability.
I still think this is going to be. Small countries will develop some capabilities, and they will be able to project it. I still think this is going to be a big power game, right? Because still the capabilities needed to design the weapon, deliver the weapon, are going to be the big rich countries. And it may change over time if the talent is pushed even further down. But right now, the top 7 or 8 countries are the usual suspects: Russia, China, U.S., Israel, France, Germany, UK. These are the ones that have the most capabilities. Again, over time it may change, but I still think it's a big power game.
I have 2 questions for you. One is, what can the normal person do to prevent such things or to be better aware of security? Yeah. And the second one is, you mentioned drones when you mentioned the US Department's finances. So what role do you think drones will play in cyber warfare in the future? Because they will be operated by computers or some such. Yeah.
So what you can do to better defend yourself, don't click on any links before you've had your first cup of tea or coffee, I would suggest. So I would look at the email that you receive and make sure that the address looks like it's something you're expecting. I don't open anything I'm not expecting, right? So if somebody I don't know sends me a PDF, I won't open it. I will either write back to them and say, can you please, post it in the body of the email so I can read it there, or I'll call them and say, did you actually send this to me? So that's one thing to do. The other stuff is, which I don't know if it's already enabled here. Probably the most important thing is two-factor authentication. If everyone has that on their accounts, so if for your Gmail or whatever account, that you have the code sent to you on your phone in case somebody does it in another location. Those are the 2 most important things. Everything else, you could start encrypting. So the problem is you have to do it, of course, on a clean system, on a system that already hasn't been violated. There are some pretty easy encryption systems that you can use that are built into Mac and into Microsoft Word. But if you lose the password, you're in big trouble. And I encrypt mine, but my wife hates it. She won't do it because you have to enter this 24-character password anytime you want to do anything, and it's just not convenient. Yes. And I'm not entirely sure that the system wasn't completely clean when I did it.
Hello. Yeah. My question is.
The drones. So yes, there's been a lot of talk about automation of warfare, and cyber is going to be part of it, right? The systems are all going to be involved. So on one hand, that'll be a vulnerability, right? Those systems will be clearly a target of attack, especially if you're a country that doesn't have drones. You're going to want to make sure that you take them out. And the Iranians claimed to hack a U.S. drone once and steer it into Iran. So I think that's going to be a major area of growth.
Yeah. We are producing a lot of data every day, video and all those things, all those stuff on the mobiles. Can we expect a doomsday one day?
We expect.
Can we expect an end of it?
An end of data?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think we're going to continue generating data.
Okay.
We may decide that we don't want to keep it anymore.
Okay.
Where
do we throw it?
What's that?
Where do we throw it?
I don't think we've decided. We don't know, right? one of the things for security reasons, we've decided we can only keep emails for 6 months now, right?
On the lighter vein, I take my friend's mobile
Yeah.
and look at his data. Is it part of cyber crime?
It would be an invasion of privacy, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Backup. Yeah.
I have two questions. When internet came, it was touted as now like the world is global village. But now we got into a situation where there are feudal landlords claiming supremacy over
Yeah.
the space. So, and then on the other side we have this collateral damage, like with drones we have seen, so many thousands of innocent people getting killed. So this regulation, extreme regulation, will also not lead to that kind of collateral damage.
So I think you're right. Several people have used the feudal metaphor, analogy of where we're going, and the feudal lords are both the governments and the companies, right? Because if I'm inside an Apple system and I use iPhone and the App Store and my Mac book, then I'm inside the what's called a walled garden sometimes, right? And basically I say, all right, security is too complicated. I don't really want to know what goes on underneath the hood, and I'm going to let Apple deal with all of it. And that is not, the original vision of the internet, right? So the vision of the internet was kind of permissionless innovation, right? Everybody could take their PC and come up with the next thing. So I think we are going to lose some of that. And then at the national level, more and more, either for security reasons or cultural reasons, keeping certain things out, right? Or saying, you need to store your data here. And so the kind of global platform, I think, is going to end. I think the damage is going to be both, kind of this original vision of the internet and some of this kind of free open space. Will we be caught in some collateral damage from a cyber attack? I guess it's possible. You can imagine if some attack that damages my data or, damages something that I own or whatever, that could be a real possibility.
I've read reports that the Indian government has banned projects from Chinese vendors, such as Huawei, for security reasons. So is that justified?
So the United States also bans Huawei products for security reasons. I think it is probably justified, but we've gone about it the wrong way. Right? So there is much that Huawei has done, especially when in the earlier stages, that it did not handle globalization and entering new markets particularly well. In the U.S. case, it was not transparent. It tried to buy a number of companies that had security implications without telling anyone, that were discovered through other ways. And they were evasive about lots of things that they shouldn't have been evasive about. The problem is that when the U.S. investigated Huawei and they produced this big report, the report has nothing in it. Right? No evidence that Huawei has ever done anything. And the evidence that the U.S. supplied is true of any company that produces in China. Right? So it basically says Huawei has security risks. It produces in China. The supply chain could be accessed by Chinese military or intelligence. It has Chinese managers and all these things. But that is true for Cisco. Right? They produce in China. They have Chinese managers. The supply chain is accessible there. So while I still think there is reason to be suspicious, I don't think the United States went about it the right way. It may be that the UK did it the right way. So the UK has Huawei products at the highest level. And the agreement there was there's an inspection center that Huawei shows everything that's happening. And that inspection center is manned by GCHQ, right, by the intelligence agencies. And after the first year, GCHQ produced a report and said, we don't see anything. The problem is that it may be that nothing's happening now, but you could always update it. right? So the software can always be updated and pushed. And the argument isn't so much that Huawei right now is doing something, but could it resist pressure from the Chinese government to do something? Maybe not. You can make the same argument about Microsoft, though. Right? It couldn't resist it. Under U.S. law, it had to give certain types of information. So I think one of the arguments has been, we don't know what the Chinese government is going to say to Huawei 5 years from now.
This is regarding the usage of the emails by the government officials. A lot of them, emails have been originally created for a common man use. A lot of government officials are also start using it. Both that is happening in India and abroad also. How safe or how advisable is it?
I'm sorry, to use a common email?
Yes.
Well, my understanding is that Indian government officials are no longer supposed to use supplies. Although I've met several government officials on this trip, and I see that their email address is Hotmail or Yahoo or Gmail. And this happened in Brazil as well. Same thing, all Brazilian government officials were taken off Gmail, and they were put on a Brazilian server. How much safer is it? If they want to read what you're doing, not safer at all, right? Because there's no reason to believe that the Indian server or the Indian email, because if they're going to, for example, spearfish you, then you're going to be just as vulnerable as you are on an Indian server as you would on Gmail. Does it make it less likely that a cop in the United States can see the data? Maybe. But the NSA, if it wants to get your email, is going to get it if it's Gmail or if it's going to get it if it's the Indian server. So it may provide some semblance of greater security, but it's not going to really make a difference.
You said you can identify the attacker now. That capability is available.
Over time.
But you cannot prove it, right? Yet. So even though you can identify that it is an ex-gentleman in a town in China who did it, you really cannot prove that.
So I can say it came from...
Otherwise, you should be able to lay it at the doors of the Chinese government.
Well, so the question is proof, right? Does it have to be the level of a court proof, or can it be diplomatic proof, right? So, and what type of evidence are you willing to show? This is the big question, right? Because when the Sony attack first happened, the U.S. said, we know it's North Korea. And they provided a level of evidence that for most people was not convincing. So they said, here are the IP addresses, right? Here are the addresses of where the attacks came from. Here are some techniques that we know North Korean attackers use. Here is some software that was used in an attack on Seoul, on South Korea. All of those things can be used by other hackers, right? You can use another IP address. That's only circumstantial evidence. So then the U.S. was forced to say, well, actually, we have other evidence. That other evidence was from Snowden revelations. The U.S. never came out and said it, but at that time, some Snowden revelations came out. And what came out was, this is a good story. What came out was that the South Koreans were hacking the United States. The NSA saw it, and they hacked back into South Korean computers. While they were sitting on the South Korean computers, they saw that the South Koreans had also hacked into North Korean computers. And they said, oh, this is pretty good. And they went from the South Korean computers into the North Korean computers. So that's how that they saw that there was evidence that the North Koreans had launched the attack. But they didn't want to reveal that publicly, right? That was too valuable an asset to want to give up. So in the case of where these companies identified these specific individuals, so they had their IP addresses. They had, these guys used these names online when they hacked, and they used it in the malware that they wrote. But they also used it because, some of them were motorcycle aficionados, and they went to websites and talked about motorcycles, and they used the same names. And then they took pictures of their birthday parties. And the pictures of the birthday party were inside the PLA barracks. And some of them are wearing their hats, and you can see the insignia on some of their sleeves. So they took all of that information and they put it together, and they said, here is the IP address. It's coming at this time. It seems to be coming from this block. right? Because we know these IP addresses are on this block. On this block, there happens to be this 7-story building that's owned by the PLA that has this humongous cable carrying internet data on it. So as far as we can tell, it's these guys. But again, circumstantial evidence, but highly circumstantial.
Hello, sir. You talked about proportionality at the start of the talk, right?
Yeah.
And then you said, how much damage is it? Like, if China attacks Indian health records, how many days should it do it? So the question is, if China hacks Indian health records, doesn't it make sense to India to hack reverse Chinese health records? Right?
So that would be one answer, right, is that proportional means just the same type of attack. But part of the problem is that a lot of the countries that launch these attacks or are interested don't have the same targets, right? So what would proportional be for North Korea for the Sony hack, right? The North Koreans, what would damage one of the films that North Korea is going to release? That is not necessarily proportional. So what the United States was forced to do was economic sanctions. But North Korea is already under so many economic sanctions, it's not clear that that's proportional either. So it may be that in some instances you could do one-to-one, right? But in other cases, if it's an undeveloped country, you may decide, what, I'm just going to blow something up.
Sir, I'm Thomas. I'm a financial advisor. In Hyderabad, so many people are sending messages about commercial information about policies and mutual funds.
Yeah.
And some people send emails with incomplete information. And I go with 16-page reports, the entire brochure, and I also show the force majeure clauses. So, not showing the complete information, is it a part of cybercrime?
I don't think so. I think it would just
concealment of important information?
I think it would just be fraud. I don't think it would be cybercrime.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you about the ethical issues in cybercrime, because this was a subject never dealt strongly. Who's going to take the responsibility of the ethical issues? And now talking about the social media, more and more oligarchs are coming in social media, like what we have in print and electronic media. So do we see any potential threat from these oligarchs like Facebook and Google? Because there is so much of information available with them.
Yeah. So on the first question, I think if you're using ethical to mean moral and just and not ethical hackers, but there is a very slow debate coming up that, in fact, cyber attacks may be more ethical than a physical attack, right? So, for example, if the United States was going to invade another country, I hope we're not going to, but if we're going to invade another country, instead of bombing the power grid, if you can just take it out with a cyber attack, right, then you don't have to worry about collateral death. You don't have to worry about rebuilding. You can just switch it back on, right? And so you can imagine that there may be in the future an ethical imperative to do a cyber attack if you have the capacity, as opposed to a physical attack. But I don't think we're anywhere there to describing what that might be.
Is it conceivable, Adam, that let's say Pakistan does a cyber attack on India and does it in a manner where the Indian nuclear arms detonate now here?
Yes. So I think we have to hope that everyone's nuclear program is not connected to the internet, right? So
except to Yahoo.
So the expectation is that nuclear control systems are separate, and that seems to be the case. Are we going to discover someday that somebody has done something that they shouldn't have done? Probably, but that is a big area of concern. So there is a focus, and people are beginning to think about how do you again make sure there's no escalation. That because if you were India and you saw a hacking attack that you thought was directed at your nuclear command and control systems, you would be very likely to respond very quickly. So you would want to control for that. Yeah. So on the question about the oligarchs, or I'll just put it the companies themselves, right? So as I mentioned before, Facebook and Gmail have more users than most countries. So I think there's two, and I won't put it on Zuckerberg or Brin or those people. I think the issue for almost everywhere is that these are platforms that are used globally, but they're still American companies, right? And they are basically still guided by American law and legislation. Of course, depends what you do in country, right? And what the companies have basically done is, like for example in Brazil, they said, oh, we only do marketing here. We don't have a real office here, which prevents the Brazilian government from saying, turn over the data, right? But that's why the Brazilian government has said you need to start storing data locally. And what India, Microsoft is moving here and Amazon is moving data here, in part probably because the Indian government said we need to have the data here. So that, I think, if you are a government of another country, here is this asset that controls all of this information of your citizens, and you have no control over it. Right? You can block it, but that's a very blunt tool. I think the problem has been also from an American user perspective is that the companies have traditionally had an attitude of, well, let's make the mistake first and then we'll apologize, right? Because their business model is data. We need to have as much data as we can, and it may be that they're in California and that they're young and they don't worry about privacy as much, or they're not concerned about things, and so their attitude has been to kind of roll something out, and then when everybody says, oh my God, this is terrible, then they say, oh, we didn't mean it that way. And then they bring it back. So that model is slowly beginning to change, and I think they're becoming more sensitive to it. But if I'm not on Facebook, but my wife just joined, and she was trying to figure out how do you control your data. And it's still very, very hard. And I think, that's intentional. Yes. Yes. In some ways, paradoxically, it may be worse. Because, yeah, so it's going to be, even if there's a data storage here, you still have to back it up. That's the whole point of having a cloud, right? But the other thing from a legal point of view is that if Indian data is stored in the United States, it's on U.S. servers. So the NSA can only they can get into it, but they needed a warrant. If it's stored in a foreign server, it's a foreign national. They don't need a warrant. No, in some ways they make the problem worse.
I have two questions for you.
Last two questions.
Sir.
Okay, yeah. Last two questions.
Sir, I have two questions for you.
One.
One is, where do you think India is standing internationally as a threat to international market as a hacker? First one. And second one is, being a banker, I would like to know where the banking sector in India stands, or how vulnerable is the banking sector in India for cyber crimes?
So it's interesting. I would expect to hear more about Indian hackers, right? Why all these people who code and program, and you don't hear about Indian hackers very often. I guess there is a very famous Bardi, I don't remember his Bardia, who is was a very famous hacker and now is working for the government and has been a white hacker. I don't see Indian hackers ranked all that often. So what we generally hear is that the Russians are the best. Well, actually, NSA hackers are the best, and then Russian hackers are below that, and then the Chinese are the noisiest. They just kind of were the most prolific, and then I think below that, in the top 10 maybe Indians, but I don't see very much about that. On the Indian banking side, again, one of the issues has been that U.S. companies report. They don't want to report, but they say, J.P. Morgan says we've been hacked. My sense is that Indian companies don't discuss it. So it has to be happening, right? There's no reason to believe that Indian bankers are so much better than J.P. Morgan, who spent $250 million last year on cybersecurity. I'm gathering that there's no Indian bank that spent $250 million on cybersecurity last year. So I have to assume that it's probably pretty bad, but not bad enough that's affected their business. right? So they're willing to put up with the loss, but not affecting operations yet.
Thank you very much for a very
The
wonderful
last question there.
wonderful the talk upon this one, the favorite topic, cybersecurity and cyber war. And we are not even talked about the cybernetics. That brings, and keeping in mind the Nigerian fraud also, this one comes into the post. But how and which country and from where we received the first cyber attack or cyber war? In which day, in which year, and why?
If I could predict that, my next book would be much, much better. Let's put it this way. Cyber attacks are going to be part of any conflict. Right? The next war that we have between any major powers is going to involve a cyber component. It may just be attacks on other military networks, but it is going to involve a cyber component. So far, we haven't seen it because it isn't necessary. Right? So when the United States decided to take out Libya's air coverage, it thought about using cyber attacks. But it was too risky. They weren't sure they were going to work when they knew that a missile would work. Right? Israel, when it attacked the Syrian nuclear program, it may have used a cyber attack first to take out the air defenses. It may have also just used another device. But whatever the next war is, so a real war will involve cyber weapons. Unfortunately, I cannot predict that.
My last question. Would the unit of warfare come down from a country to a company? Can Microsoft not launch a cyber war attack?
Yes, so this has been a big debate in the States, which has been, wouldn't be a war, but in the States there's been a debate about what's called hacking back or active defense. So the idea... Or offense. The idea, well, offense we already know. Private companies already exist that develop offensive capabilities. They tend to be European because it's illegal in the U.S., but they sell the weapons, and there's an attempt now to control that through dual-use export control things. On the defensive side, there has been a debate that basically says, oh, the government can't protect me, and so I should be allowed to hack back. You know, the people that are attacking me, I should be allowed to go after. The problem is illegal. In the United States, it's illegal under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that you cannot enter another good thing. No one's ever been prosecuted. And lots of people say, oh, I don't do it, but I know someone who does it. Or the answer seems to be most recently, you go to Israel, and you sit in a cafe in Tel Aviv, and you say, oh, who will rid me of this problem? And some Israeli says, oh, I have a company. And you hire them, which would also be illegal. So there's been a debate about should we kind of have like pirates, like Sir Walter Riley, right? And we'll have letters of marque. And certain companies would be regulated and be allowed to attack. I think it's a terrible, terrible idea, right? Because you can imagine that U.S. and China get into tensions over the South China Sea. And all of a sudden companies start hacking back at each other. We don't want that. We want to send a message about what this hack meant or that hack meant. We want to have a clear kind of escalation ladder that having Microsoft involved would really ruin things.
And that's not going to happen.
No.